Okay, guys, we're on to our next talk of the day, and we're going to have Dr. Tyler Wish join us on stage shortly. Tyler is a trained epidemiologist, biotechnology entrepreneur, interested in data-driven medicine and computational drug discovery. I'll let him explain what that means. So Tyler co-founded Sequence Bio, a privately held venture-backed biotech company. He also is an advocate for Canadian-led innovation. He was appointed a Canadian Innovation Leader by the federal government and youth STEM education. He received his BSc in chemistry from the University of Victoria and a PhD from Memorial University of Newfoundland. And he's also the director of NAC Bio, which is our research division based out in Vancouver. And he's going to be talking about precision cannabis. And welcome, Dr. Tyler Wish.
You can hear me okay? Yeah. Great. So thanks very much, Bram. So today I'm going to go through just really three things quickly. One will be just to provide some context around this emerging paradigm of data-driven medicine and drug discovery. Then touch upon how that perhaps adds some value to the medicinal cannabis space. And then talk a bit about this new initiative that is going to be very much focused on enhancing patient outcomes and innovation through large-scale data. I'll just start by saying that we live in extraordinary times, and over the last decade or two, we've witnessed some dramatic changes in our world based on the democratization of information and technology. It was only about 10 years ago that I was enduring some graduate level courses in applied statistics, and I remember building regression models that looked at perhaps 100 subjects across maybe 10 relatively simplistic clinical variables. Fast forward to today, and it's not unusual for a Stanford graduate student to be analyzing billions and billions of data points, leveraging sophisticated machine learning algorithms on cloud computing infrastructure. From this perspective, my training, and likely yours, almost seems archaic, but there's probably a good reason for this. If you look at technological advancement over the past 100 years, there's good reason to see why it looks more and more like exponential growth. Think about robotics, sensors, solar panel, genomic sequencing technologies. And what's perhaps even more interesting is that while each of these technologies independently is advancing exponentially, the aggregate output of these interactions has potentially really profound consequences for society. And we're seeing evidence of this in the last couple of years. Think about energy and how the advancements in solar panel technology and battery technology is really disrupting the energy business. Or think about transportation and how the electric car and autonomous vehicles are really disrupting transportation. And banking as well. The demonetization, the democratization of technologies like blockchain are really fundamentally changing how banking is happening. The life sciences is another area that's being disrupted by technology. The data-rich opportunities are really starting to manifest across the entire ecosystem, from drug discovery to healthcare and medicine, and even into the health and wellness industries. We're seeing many examples of this. If you look at drug discovery as an example, the research and development part of the drug discovery business has really faced a lot of challenges over the past couple of decades. It's becoming more and more difficult to bring novel therapeutics to market. In fact, 90 to 95% of all compounds that enter phase 1 clinical trials ultimately fail. And unfortunately, the drugs that do make it to market don't work very well in heterogeneous disease populations, as this infographic from Nature demonstrates. In this case, the analysis based on the numbers needed to treat suggests that to achieve a single adequate clinical response requires these patients to be dosed, or requires 3 to 24 different patients to be dosed in order to achieve one clinical response. And although this might not be surprising to you as a healthcare provider that deals with this unfortunate truth every day, it certainly highlights one of the major issues for our healthcare system and medicine in general, which is we have a really, the reality is that we have a very poor understanding of causal human biology. And the reason for this issue is thought to be because of our long-standing reliance on non-human models to understand human biology. Not surprisingly, it turns out that dogs, rats, and zebrafish are poor human analogs. But things are changing rapidly. The ability to interrogate and analyze the human genome and human biology at far greater resolution is changing the strategy with which we identify pathways and novel targets. This is a bit over complex, but what it's basically suggesting is that we're now using humans as the early model to understand human biology from which to develop new drugs. And we can interrogate the human health and disease pathways by leveraging a number of these novel technologies across multiple different cell types using different omics strategies. That then informs the design of animal models and other models to develop new compounds. All of this is thought to enhance the success and the efficacy of modern drugs going forward. It's not just drug discovery that's being disrupted by these technologies, it's also healthcare and medicine, particularly in the fields of radiology, dermatology, and digital pathology. In the last 12 months or so, we've seen extraordinary evidence of how machine learning algorithms are performing as good or better than highly qualified, highly trained medical professionals in terms of diagnosing diabetic retinopathies, lymph node metastasis, and classifying skin lesions. In the case of classifying skin lesions, the implications are potentially very profound. It's estimated, for example, that there will be 6.3 billion smartphone subscriptions around the world by 2021, thereby potentially providing low-cost, high-quality, almost universal access to vital diagnostic care to much of the world's population, simply from a phone app on your, from a camera app on your phone. And although this is incredibly impressive, and I think this will advance rapidly in the coming years, there is suggestions that the technology is even more powerful and more profound. I would say almost crossing over into the spooky kind of realm. And this is one example of that. This is a paper published by Google just a few months ago. So in this example, Google fed a machine learning algorithm a couple 100,000 images of your retinal scans, a simple picture of your retina, and asked the algorithm to predict your risk of developing a cardiovascular event over the subsequent 5 years. The way this works is you feed an image to the algorithm. It's tagged with data like about your age, your sex, your systolic blood pressure, your BMI, et cetera, et cetera. And as you feed these images one by one to the algorithm, it automatically on its own tweaks the model to get better and better at classifying and predicting these features. So in this case, in this example, after reviewing a couple 100,000 images, the algorithm was very good at predicting your age, your gender, your smoking status, your HbA1c status, your BMI, your systolic blood pressure, et cetera, with very, very good accuracy. All of these things, of course, are predictors of cardiovascular disease. And so when you ask the model to predict the risk of developing a cardiovascular event, it does so with as good accuracy as our best leading clinical models. What's striking about this is two things. One is that, as you can see sort of in the green highlighted areas of these images, the AI algorithm, keep in mind it has zero domain knowledge about anything about medicine or biology, but after reviewing a couple of hundred images, it's extracting features about a retina that we previously had no knowledge about. We had no idea that you could extract this type of information out of a retina image. And so in some cases, the AI is looking at vascular features or the optic disc, I think in the case of gender, to make these predictions. So that's one striking thing about this novel technology. The second is that unlike our current best predictor of cardiovascular disease, which requires blood chemistries and a lot of workup, this simply requires a very cheap and inexpensive retinal image, something that, again, could be taken with a smartphone. So just a highlight of where some of this technology is headed. And it's not just drug discovery, it's not just health and medicine, it's also extending into the health and wellness industry, which has always been an opportunity for new ideas and new technology to manifest. And perhaps one of the best examples of this is the California-based direct-to-consumer genetics company, 23andMe. Some of you are probably familiar with this. More than 1 million people have provided their genetic data to 23andMe in California, and millions of others have provided their information to other companies and initiatives in exchange for data-driven insights about their ancestry, their fitness, their health, their diet, their disease risks, treatment, and prognosis. You know, there's many issues, of course, that we could discuss about the direct-to-consumer model, but I think, you know, one thing that I want to highlight is I think here we are in 2018, and I think this model is really starting to disrupt the traditional physician-patient model. And I think this trend might continue because of the powerful forces of digitization. Increasingly, our health information is being digitized and becoming more accessible. Demonetization, technologies like genomic sequencing, the cost of these things is coming down tremendously. And finally, democratization. Companies like 23andMe and others are enabling consumers to have greater control of their healthcare information and decision-making. What I find also interesting about this space is that over the last few years, some of the US's leading entrepreneurial research scientists have all recently founded consumer-facing healthcare companies. People like Craig Venter, who is the pioneer in sequencing the human genome, has founded Human Longevity in San Diego. Eric Schott, who is one of the pioneers of this data-driven drug discovery business, has founded Sema4, a direct-to-consumer genetics company. And Leroy Hood in Seattle, who's one of the pioneers of this idea of precision personalized medicine, has formed a company called Areval in Seattle. This image is a photo of a snapshot of the homepage of Areval, and I think it's a really interesting model for healthcare going forward, but I think there's also some interesting parallels with NAC. Areval is, in some ways, very similar to an executive healthcare business, where they, for a fee, they do a very deep dive on you from a medical perspective and then provide ongoing counseling and support going forward. But Areval is interesting because it leverages a very data-centric approach. They do a deep dive on omics and deep dive on clinical chemistries, and based on these data models, provide you with a pathway to optimize your health going forward. And it's not just that initial assessment. There's some ongoing consultation. There's a quarterly visit, quarterly coaching from a holistic team of healthcare providers. I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I think it certainly suggests that healthcare is moving in a data-driven type of direction. Now, one of the major consequences of all of this newfound capabilities and interest in leveraging data is, of course, then to develop these large-scale data assets. Data is, of course, the raw resource and the fuel necessary for innovation. And so in the last 5 years, we've seen a huge uptake in the interest of nations, of companies, of nonprofit organizations, developing these large-scale integrated phenotypic, genotypic data sets around the globe. As I mentioned, there's 23andMe on the west coast of the US with 1 million DNA samples in a for-profit model. There's Decode Genetics based in Reykjavik, Iceland. This is an example of, it's a well-known example of a for-profit company leveraging the unique genetics of an entire country to advance genetic-driven drug discovery. There's other types of initiatives like Genomic England, where it's more of a public sector model. In this case, Genomics England is sequencing the genomes of 100,000 people, mostly aimed at enhancing healthcare outcomes. But there's an enormous for-profit aspect of that project as well, as they've partnered with virtually every single major pharmaceutical company to support drug discovery. There's other state-sponsored initiatives like in China and Qatar and Estonia that are structured similarly. One of my more interesting models is a project called MyCode on the East Coast of the United States. This is a collaboration between Geisinger Healthcare Systems, in effect a large healthcare provider, and Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. It's a successful big biotech company. They are sequencing the genomes, I think thus far, of 300,000 of their patients. And the model, in my opinion, is nice because that information gets shared with patients and providers to enhance care, but the data also gets utilized by Regeneron to advance innovation in drug discovery. Canada has really only one project, in my opinion, that's sort of on par with this global trend. This is a company, a private venture-backed company called Sequence Bio, that was co-founded by myself in Newfoundland in 2013. If you didn't know, Newfoundland turns out to be one of the most interesting jurisdictions in the world to do modern drug discovery. Like Iceland, the population of Newfoundland is very inbred or homogeneous or related, whichever you prefer. And that's really related to its history. So Newfoundland was founded about 400 years ago by about 10,000 people from Southwest Ireland and England. And since that time, no one's left and no one's really come there except a couple graduate students and some other folks. So what you end up with now after 400 years of intermarriage and large families is 500,000 people who are highly homogeneous. And this results in two things that are very attractive for drug discovery. One is just it maximizes signal to noise. So all this genetic data, we're looking for very small but important signals, and that similarity just makes that process a little bit easier. The second thing is that the population has incredibly high incidence of all these rare Mendelian disorders that can be really helpful for drug discovery. So one example of that is there's a family in Newfoundland affected by congenital indifference to pain. So in effect, these children feel no pain whatsoever. And it's incredibly harmful. They burn themselves, they bite their tongues off, they come home with multiple fractures without knowing this. But it's also terribly interesting once you get the family into the clinic and identify the mutation responsible. You can then reverse engineer that knowledge to develop non-opioid pain medications. So just an example of how these rare Mendelian conditions in these interesting populations can advance drug discovery and innovation. So that was just a really quick snapshot, obviously, on kind of this new paradigm of data-driven drug discovery, data-driven medicine and health, and how it's having implications for various other health and wellness industries. I won't talk much more about Sequence, but I think what I wanted to do next then is, with that context, think about the medicinal cannabis space and perhaps how some of these modern tools and approaches might add some value. First, let's consider the quality of the data that currently exists. At present, we know that there's some high-quality clinical evidence supporting its use for a number of conditions. There's a lot of other observational and weaker evidence for a number of other conditions. And then, of course, there's a tremendous amount of very interesting anecdotal data which needs to be investigated further. But from my vantage point, I wonder, whether the industry has really assembled the right infrastructure that would allow us to have a much deeper understanding of the impacts of medicinal cannabis, and whether we could really, do we have the evidence necessary to develop best care practices, enable more personalized care, and support further innovation, particularly within therapeutic discovery. So in other words, relative to what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry, does the cannabis space have a 50,000 person user base with integrated clinical genomic outcomes? And to the best of my knowledge, nothing of that scale or magnitude exists. Furthermore, despite having some good clinical evidence, I still question about whether or not we have the right data, the right stack of data to really explore the mechanistic understanding or relationships between medicinal cannabis and human biology. I think there's tremendous value in pursuing this further, as uncovering these biological mechanisms is likely to elucidate a number of therapeutic opportunities that will not only enhance care, but support innovation and commercialization. And finally, has the industry developed the digital infrastructure that's required to generate, analyze, and share large-scale information needed to support further clinical development, regulatory approval, payer reimbursement, all of which is going to be tremendously necessary as this industry matures. At the same time, or on the other side of the coin, I find the space terribly interesting because for me it represents a beautiful, absolutely beautiful big data problem. When you consider the complexity of investigating hundreds of compounds in combination across dozens of different disease indications, each with their own patient subpopulations, that are influenced by subtle genomic and environmental effects. And connecting all of that information with short and long-term patient outcomes, it really is a beautiful big data problem. But as I've said, understanding this complexity is going to be necessary in order to maximize the benefits of these products. Unfortunately, as I've kind of quickly previewed, we have very capable tools and approaches now to generate and analyze this type of information and generate actionable insight from this complexity. Whether it's characterizing the chemical composition of these strains, to using wearable and digital health technologies to capture patient outcomes, and to leveraging sophisticated machine learning approaches to extract novel insights. Let me give you a quick sort of example of what that might look like. This is one of my favorite data visualization technologies called topological data analysis. It builds similarity networks based on the underlying data structure of the data model. This is an example of a project out of New York that looked at the electronic healthcare records of 10,000 New Yorkers. And so every point on that graph is a patient or a very small cluster of very similar patients. And the similarity network gets developed based on how similar patients are to one another based on their electronic health record profile. So in this case, looking at 10,000 patients based on their EHR data, you get two large clusters. On the left-hand side, you get a cluster that looks like a tropical fish. On the right-hand side, you get one that looks like South America. And what researchers in this project were interested in doing is understanding type 2 diabetes. You light the network up in red for type 2 diabetic patients, and you start to see there might be 5, 6 different types of type 2 diabetic patients embedded within a healthcare system. As the research went a bit further, they kind of really identified 3 distinct, unique profiles of type 2 diabetic patients that were associated with a very distinct clinical and genomic profile. So that's just sort of give you a sense of how we can leverage big data and these data visualization technologies to extract novel insights. Now, I am very curious to understand what the 15,000 plus patients in NAC's database might look like if we had integrated clinical, genomic, and outcome data. I think, for example, if we were to look specifically at subpopulations of IBS or Crohn's patients, we might see that particular subpopulations of that patient population responds differently from one strain or one product to the next. And we could perhaps use that information to help healthcare providers and patients make better choices about the right therapy. In other words, to create more of an individualized, personalized cannabis paradigm. I suspect that this type of platform and data would also help us in the therapeutic discovery process. We might start to see, for some reason, certain compounds in certain disease populations are achieving the right effect, giving us hypothesis to investigate why a single or a combination of compounds within a particular strain of cannabis is worth pursuing and isolating further. And finally, what's interesting is that when you have, from the collective perspective, when you have all, say, 15 or 50,000 well-characterized patients, it gives you tremendous opportunities to support further clinical development, regulatory development, and payer insights from the perspective of providing real-world evidence to these stakeholders. I think this type of data asset will be very much needed going forward, as I've mentioned already. To make real advancements, to make real impact, requires not just scale, but depth. And so this is an image that Eric Topol has sort of made famous, and what he's done here obviously is to think about human biology much like a GIS map on your phone, Google Maps, for example. And this is the type of information layers that we really need to connect and link in order to have a deeper dive into this space. So there's really, 2 things that matter in today's data-driven world: scale and depth, I would call it, linking all of these various layers of information. And so we have choices as a research organization, of course, in terms of how to focus our efforts. And all of these vary tremendously in terms of scale, complexity, and costs. From my perspective, I think to really make the most impact in the medicinal cannabis space, for us to do that really needs to follow some of the current trends in terms of developing large-scale data assets that integrate a lot of this information. So with that in mind, We've recently announced a new initiative led by NAC called NAC Bio. And the vision here is really to assemble a large-scale data asset, or knowledge-based, with consenting voluntary patients from NAC, and use that knowledge base to support two programs. One is really to use this information to make it to support better patient care. What we're interested in doing, of course, is generating data, generating insights, and returning that or making that available back to the NAC network, back to the care providers, and back to patients to make better, more informed, evidence-based decisions around patient care. The second aspect of it on the right-hand side of the figure is to support innovation, of course. And we think about innovation in three different buckets. The first is therapeutic discovery. As I mentioned, I think these types of data assets will allow us to explore how these compounds interact with human biology more deeply. And I think we're at the very beginning of this process. Given that there's hundreds of these compounds that at the moment have very little evidence or knowledge, I think there is a lot of green field ahead of us. We think there are opportunities in the direct-to-consumer health and wellness business, perhaps particularly with the recreational market. Our thesis being that a lot of recreational users will be self-medicating. Perhaps we can provide some data-driven insights that would support recreational users in the decision-making process. And finally, real-world evidence. This is an enormous field within the traditional pharmaceutical paradigm, but as the medicinal cannabis industry becomes more and more legitimate globally, and as the innovation pipeline matures and develops, there's going to be a tremendous need to have data to support clinical development, regulatory approval, payer reimbursement, and we see that as a huge opportunity. So the first part of this initiative is obviously to build that knowledge base, and the approach that we're interested in exploring is one to develop a large-scale patient registry. As I mentioned, we have multiple options. We could focus our efforts on multiple small observational studies. We could lead a single large-scale RCT. They could all cost the same amount of money, but they have drastically different outcomes with respect to enhancing care and supporting innovation. We think a patient registry, a large-scale patient registry, which collects baseline clinical, prescription data, genomic data, and linking long-term patient outcome data across multiple disease indications is the best strategy going forward. So this is very much like a plain vanilla registry that you'll be familiar with. Again, it's in collaboration with NAC, where we'll be engaging the ecosystem, many of you, hopefully, and asking for the engagement and consent of patients to participate in this process. At enrollment, we'll of course be obtaining consent. There'll be some baseline data capture. That would like to include linkage to administrative data sets, so we can get the deepest phenotypic profile on these patients in terms of their medical history, their hospitalization, their insurance, their billing information. All of that is very important in today's world to really extract insights about future therapy. This will also involve a saliva sample. So this is kind of routine now in these large-scale registries. We'll use a cool technology out of Ottawa called DNA Genotek to collect a saliva sample that will most likely ship to Toronto, where it'll be processed, banked, and sequenced, leveraging cloud infrastructure. And then probably the most critical part of this is linking outcome information. And that is very difficult to do, but we're very interested in exploring mobile technologies to capture patient-reported outcome data. And so we're building this technology and collaborating with others to build this technology. We're going to rely heavily on virtual platform, much like 23andMe. What's critical here is that we have long-term engagement with these patients who are contributing high-quality data. There are a lot of complexities associated with this, particularly as we're not building a registry focused on any one specific disease indication, but multiple indications. And so we're in the process of developing mobile technologies that will integrate all of this information for a patient and then design specific patient or indication-specific pathways around data capture. So depending on whether you're an arthritis patient, a pain patient, an OA patient, you'll be walked through a specific protocol on your mobile device around data capture and data input. So for some patients, the type of survey, the type of information, and the timing of that information will be specific and nuanced to your primary indication. So I just finished with 2 points here. So the first is that, just where we are operationally. So the company was just literally founded, I believe, in June. We've spent a couple of months scoping out the project, starting to form some of our initial partnerships and collaborations. We've engaged several groups now to help us on the scientific front, building protocols, building documentation around the ethical, legal, social issues of this, which is obviously very, very important when we're managing potentially 50,000 people's genomic information. And these are challenging issues, but by no means are we doing something that hasn't been done around the globe on a large scale. But it has to be done right, of course. And so we're leveraging some of the best people and best groups in the world to develop those policies and procedures for us. At the same time, we're building technology. So like this patient-reported outcome tool, so that we can hopefully by Q1 of next year have our first patient in and start ramping up from there. I think it's likely that we will pilot in Ontario and expand geographically throughout Canada next year. And of course, we think there's potentially opportunities to go international with this as well. The last thing I'll comment on is that this initiative really depends on engagement. It really depends on collaboration between the staff at NAC, the folks at NAC Bio, and the extended network, physicians and care providers, and of course patients. And so as this initiative gets packaged and becomes sort of deployable, we'll be doing a lot of outreach with folks like yourselves and very much looking to get insights, input, direction from you. Specifically, we'll be interested in developing steering committees, scientific advisory boards, medical advisory boards. And so again, we're hoping that this becomes a very collaborative process and that we get to work with you as key stakeholders moving forward. So there's a few minutes here. Happy to answer any questions. Happy to have a dialogue with you after this event as well. Thanks very much. Yeah, go ahead. There's a question back there. Yeah, absolutely. So there's opportunities right away for us to share this information with care providers. In fact, this one tool that we're very interested in using has the ability for the patient or the participant to create a circle of care and provide access to that information. Now, we're still working on the details, and of course, we have to be careful around things around consent. And this is a research project, and so sharing information with healthcare providers is another layer of complexity. But it's very much of interest to us, right? We want to kind of support the ecosystem. And then there's this question about how much utility can we provide you in the early days? We can provide access perhaps to some of the raw data, but is that really going to help you make decisions in the early days? Ideally, and over a short period of time, we want to build models to extract the right insights for you to make decisions. So we're very much interested in developing a treatment decision engine that would give you better, support you in making decisions. That is one of the priorities of this project. And I suspect by later in 2018, we'll have some cool things to start playing around with. Yeah, so what we're doing here is very similar to a lot of these other large-scale initiatives across the globe and in Canada. This is a research project. We aren't in these early days delivering care or providing recommendations ourselves. That's sort of a separate business model. This is simply a large-scale patient registry that will be used to support research and innovation. As I said, we want to find linkages to go back to the healthcare environment, given that NAC has a model where there is research and healthcare within the same tent, if you will. I think it gives us more flexibility and opportunity to link this information back to patients and their healthcare providers. Security and privacy are key aspects of all of these large-scale initiatives, and that's why I mentioned we're working with some really kind of world-class groups around developing procedures, policies, and infrastructure to ensure that this data is managed appropriately and in line with best care practices. I mean, there's always risk when you're managing this level and this type of data, but the trade-off is that this type of information is necessary to make innovation happen. I, as I mentioned, started a company called Sequence Bio, and we were at the time, and still are, developing the largest genomic data asset in Canada. Unfortunately for us, in 2015 and 16, Canada had no legislation, federal legislation, with respect to genetic non-discrimination. So there came at a point in time a realization that we were going to potentially uninsure an entire province because we would know all of their disease risk. So unfortunately for us, as a couple startup founders, we had to spend considerable time in Ottawa lobbying the federal government to enact new federal legislation, with the insurance lobby on the other side of the table, who's very powerful and well-resourced, and claiming that they would self-regulate with this information, which is a bunch of horseshit. Fortunately, that legislation has been enacted. And so from a liability perspective, I think it's a really progressive step. This is a bit tangential to what you're asking, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. People obviously have valid concerns about their genetic information residing somewhere in the cloud. But Canada has now, solid protections in place with respect to their employment and their health insurance. So just good question. I mean, risk mitigation is a huge element of building the foundations of this project. Meanwhile, not letting it hamper innovation. I'll come to you after. Yeah, exactly. So there'd be an online platform like 23andMe that you can log into, but also an app. And this is really important because we need the outcome data. We don't want to be tied to just having to, on a quarterly basis, ask provincial EMRs to hand over administrative data. That's just a nightmare. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a bunch of things. So one, this would be an information source for them to help them guide their decision making, perhaps, track some of their information. We see it as a source of information. Knowing that this patient struggles with a certain condition, we can push information to that, relevant information to that individual. We can also incentivize them to participate, and this is a big aspect of this app. We need to incentivize patients above and beyond just their altruistic.
So like gamifying it or giving them...
Yeah, there's monetary ways in which we can provide them incentives to continue engaging and participating on the platform, which is obviously very important to us. Building that long-term engagement with the patient is very important as we start to think about perhaps in the future providing real-world evidence and clinical trials, supporting clinical trials, having this ongoing dialogue and the ability to ping a particular patient because they fit the right profile for a clinical trial is an important aspect and important opportunity for NAC Bio and NAC. I hope that answered your question.
I see some great ideas for collaboration with not only small groups of researchers but larger groups. Like from my point of view, Canadian Partnership Against Cancer.
Yeah.
Would love something like this.
Yeah.
I'd love your Newfoundland data too, but
Yeah.
that way you could actually get a better idea of who's using, who has the potential for developing and not developing cancer over time. And also, what are the ongoing health risks or the health practices of these patients? We have some of that data, but when you've got it captured so nicely like this, you can actually make a huge splash in the future.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you've looked at, have you started to map out those collaborations?
We haven't, not in great detail, but there are some obvious ones. In the primary indications that NAC, for the patient population that NAC is seeing, those are obviously some not easy, but obvious targets, and we'd love to go build relationships with the Epilepsy Association of Canada and the OA Society of Canada, these types of groups, to really engage them and help us engage their patient populations. So the advocacy groups is what I'm getting at, yeah. And I think then there is a real thought leadership opportunity here for NAC. To say we're developing the data needed to support best care guidelines and practices, and particularly address, I think, the safety issue, which the federal government, provincial governments, law enforcement, and healthcare practitioners are concerned about. So we thought maybe to initialize some early pharmacogenomic studies where we can identify a set of clinical and genomic features that would predict that 1 in 20 psychosis event. And we think there's an opportunity to build some goodwill, some thought leadership with stakeholders who aren't pharmaceutical companies, aren't patients themselves, and really engage a broader ecosystem. Yeah, what's fun is there's just so many opportunities. When you've got an asset like this, you can really add value to a lot of different people. Cool. Well, thanks very much for your questions. Enjoy the day.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. We're going to break for lunch, but before I do that, I just want to recognize some of our sponsors: Organigram, MedRelief, Peace Naturals, Afria, Tilray, Green Relief, and AirRiser. Their generous support is partly allowing this event to take place, and we appreciate their generosity. We're just going to take a lunch break, and we will return here at 1:30 with Dr. Paul Danick from Winnipeg, and he's going to talk about medicinal cannabis in oncology, so that should be a great lecture. So we'll join you back here. Thanks.